Welcome to the New Brunswick Debrief, where we cover stories from across the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Wolastoqey that now make up New Brunswick. Our show provides an alternative to the corporate media monopoly. My name is Tobin Haley, and I am your host. Today's show is our last show of the season. The topic of today is poverty in New Brunswick. New Brunswick's status as one of the poorest provinces in the country is well known to anyone who lives here. Approximately 1 in 5 children live in poverty, people accessing social assistance live in deep poverty, and minimum wage does not provide a living wage. And it doesn't feel like the Higgs government is doing much to address these issues. Social assistance rates have remained extremely low, ranging from around $600 to $700 a month for a single individual. And the most recent minimum wage raise was 1 nickel per hour. Poverty in New Brunswick is disproportionately impacting women, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and racialized people. But New Brunswick is also home to some of the richest families in the country, including the Irvings. During the pandemic, a time when many New Brunswickers faced reduced work hours and lost their jobs, the wealth of multi-billionaires James and Arthur Irving significantly increased, according to NB Media Co-op's Susan O'Donnell. New Brunswick isn't poor. New Brunswick has an income inequality problem. Here to talk poverty, inequality, and what needs to be done are Tracy Glynn from the NB Media Co-op, Abram Lutes from the New Brunswick Common Front for Social Justice, and Charlotte County's own Tanya Hatt. We are first going to go to Tracy for some of the NB Media Co-op coverage on poverty in the province. Tracy, what are some of the pressing poverty issues that the NB Media Co-op has covered?
So I think there are 2 kinds of stories that the NB Media Co-op is covering. Stories that tackle the misconceptions around people living in poverty. So we often hear that people on social assistance are lazy and they don't want to work. But when we publish stories from people, by people that are living in poverty, we find out that there are actually a number of policies in our province that keep people poor. And I think later on in the show you'll hear from Abram Lutes from the Common Front for Social Justice, who will speak to some of these policies, like for example the household income policy that makes it really difficult for people to live together if they're on social assistance, if they live with disabilities. So one of the important stories that the NB Media Co-op has covered is a story by Caitlin Layden, who's an advocate for people living with disabilities, and she's been calling on the government to get rid of this policy, and we're hoping that we can be part of bringing forward a more just social assistance policy.
And what about some of the ways that the NB Media Co-op has covered the income inequality between sort of the wealthy families and then, much of the rest of the province?
Yeah, so a number of our stories by people like Susan O'Donnell, like you mentioned earlier, talk about the fact that our province is home to 2 billionaires, while we have some of the highest poverty rates in the country, the highest low-income social assistance rates in the country. So we've also published stories about tax havens. Alain Deneau, who's an expert on tax havens, who sat on the board of the Media Co-op last year, he's somebody who draws attention to the fact that Irving is not paying their fair share of taxes in our province, and this of course leads to the situation where we don't have the funds for health care, education, and we don't we keep people in these cycles of poverty.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for coming in and sharing your knowledge about this issue.
Well, thank you.
So, Abram and Tanya, thank you so much for being with us here today to talk about issues of poverty in New Brunswick. But before we jump right into the issues, I think the viewers would like to probably learn a little bit about you. So we'll go to Tanya first. Tanya, can you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and how you became an advocate for people living with poverty in New Brunswick?
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for having these necessary, needed conversations. I grew up in Milltown, 4th or 5th generation, and I grew up in poverty. I know intimately the struggles and the barriers and the obstacles people have to face, and all of the comorbid things that go along with that, including stigma that says because I am in a different financial bracket, I'm looked down upon and have less worth or value than somebody who is more financially secure.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about stigma at the end, I think, and invite you into that. And Abram, to you as well, can you tell the viewers a bit about you and a bit about the Common Front for Social Justice?
Sure. My name's Abram. I'm the provincial coordinator for the Common Front for Social Justice, and I'm a graduate student at Carleton University in Ottawa. About the Common Front first, the Common Front for Social Justice is a labor and community organization in New Brunswick. It advocates for low-wage workers and people in poverty. It fights for policy changes that will alleviate poverty, promote justice and solidarity in New Brunswick. It was founded in 1997 by a group of community and labor activists, and it's sort of continued on for the last 23 years, doing that work in different ways and with different projects and different campaigns. Myself, I grew up in New Brunswick in Woodstock. I went to school in Fredericton for 5 years. I'm back after a year in Ottawa. I spent some time as an activist in school, and a friend of mine told me that the Common Front was looking for a coordinator, and where poverty is such a big issue in New Brunswick, I felt like it would be a really important role to have the opportunity to be a part of.
Yeah, and you preempted my first question, which is, as folk on the front lines who witness what poverty looks like in New Brunswick and the impact that it has on people, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that New Brunswickers living with poverty are facing today? And Tanya, we'll go to you first.
You cannot thrive when you just survive. The people that live in poverty, not that everybody doesn't have challenges and obstacles, everybody does, including those with wealth. They're exacerbated by poverty. There's more depression and anxiety. If you're worried about the power getting shut off, you're worried also about then social services will find out that, and my children don't have what they need, I am risking losing my children. It's hard to get good sleep when you're worried all the time. There's more frustrations and anxieties causing more domestic and family violence to happen in homes that live in poverty because they have less coping skills. Poverty affects the physiological way our brain works. There's more cortisol. You're ready to fight or flight at any given moment. It's hard to have hopes and dreams when you are worried about, can I get to my appointment? Mm-hmm. When am I going to get my glasses? Because I can't, because I need a car. And all of those challenges together really exacerbate good health, good mental health, and there isn't much help. We need more policy change, like you said. We need more representation in government.
Yeah.
We
of
need
people living with poverty. You want to
people
see,
that
yeah.
look like me.
Yeah.
People that struggle. People that drive a piece of a car with, baloney skins for tires and no power steering. Mm-hmm. Eking out a living. The bottom teaches lessons the top doesn't. And there's more self-efficacy and more advocacy for people that have their needs met. It's hard to ask for help. And when you do ask for help, a lot of times you're treated like a burden.
Right.
And so people give up and accept the fate and use whatever coping skills gets them through the day. Mm-hmm. And trust me when I say, nobody chooses to live in poverty. It is not a choice. They make some choices, some of the people that live in poverty, they make some choices that lead to disease. But the choices are to feel better for a minute.
Yeah. And as you said, the impact of poverty on the body and on the brain, on the mental and physical well-being of the individual is so significant and so intense.
Children who grow up in poverty are the children that have a hard time regulating emotions at school. Just this week with the recent heat wave, there's a huge amount of people that don't have air conditioning or fans in their houses. And so we see children come in and they're sweaty and tired and they've been up all night uncomfortable. The same happens in the winter. Right. It's hard to study when you have power that is not always on. It's hard to be calm and regulated when you don't see that modeled in behavior, because your parents are freaked out all the time because of there's so many distractions from health and wellness.
Yeah, thanks. And to Abram, I'm thinking when Tanya's talking about, the same thing happens in the winter with the heat. The Common Front for Social Justice was just involved in a fight against the Irvings to increase the cost of oil, right, to heat people's homes.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how that dovetails exactly with what we're talking about today?
For sure.
Yeah.
So for people who don't know, New Brunswick, of the provinces in Canada, relies the most on oil as a source of heat for residences. And the lower on the income scale you get, the more probable that is, because it's sort of a cheap, easy way, especially if you live in a rural area where it's difficult to set up newer electronics to get your house refitted. Those kind of things are additionally expensive and prohibitive if you're in a rural area. And so people in poverty in rural areas depend a lot on heating oil to be able to heat their homes through the winter. And we have a regulated energy market in New Brunswick. So companies have to apply to the government to get approval to increase prices over a certain threshold. And Irving applied for probably one of the largest price increases in history for wholesale prices for heating oil. So wholesale is the price at which the person who makes the oil sells it to gas stations and other distributors. But that would have impacts across the market, including on people who buy it from the gas station or buy it from their Canadian Tire or wherever else they get it. And so we felt that it was really important for us to be involved in that, because even though it's energy policy might seem like a different field from social policy or anti-poverty, it's actually deeply connected. And so we wanted to raise the way that this would affect working people and people in poverty in New Brunswick if this increase would go through. And we were really lucky that we had a great team. We had many activists from many sectors alongside us, and we were able to push that back. But it shows that there's all kinds of actors in New Brunswick that don't take the issue of poverty seriously when it comes to making decisions.
You bring up the issue of rural housing and the cost of heating in many rural spaces, and that makes me think about how poverty looks really different across the province. So Tanya, you're a resident of Charlotte County. How does, in your view, poverty look different here than it does, say, in Moncton or even up north?
I think in some ways, urban centers have more to offer a person in living in poverty, because at least there's a bus you can take. I grew up, my mother was one of the very first people that received a low-income housing. It was out of town and we didn't have a car, and there's no way to get to town. So that was extremely expensive. We had a safe house for the very first time. It happened to have been built on a swamp and grew black mold in the basement. That was never addressed.
Right.
But we were thrilled to have windows that opened and plug-ins that worked, and felt less of a stigma until I realized that all of those houses look like institutions, and when you feel judged and condemned and shamed growing up poor, everybody knows they're welfare houses, right? There are barriers, though. There are barriers to health. I don't have many times I don't have a vehicle. If I've got an appointment in St. John, I can't go.
Right. And that's the only place you can go to get that service.
Exactly.
It's not available here
exactly.
because it's a small community.
And addiction services are even more lacking. You have to go away to get help. And you go away to a rehab or a detox center, and you detox for 5 to 7 days, and then you're set back out into the same community with the same triggers and the same hardships and the same not learning any new skills to combat. And the support isn't enough.
Right, and the infrastructure maybe
And
isn't here to
There's
support
24
the transition.
beds. There's 24 long-term beds in this whole province. I could fill 24 beds in St. Stephen and Milltown alone.
Right.
And I'm sure St. George could, and I'm sure St. Andrews could, and I'm sure Perth Andover could. Every community in this province is needing more help and support with addiction and poverty, because I think the two are very closely related.
And talking about supports that people need, let's talk about social assistance rates. They're crushingly low in this province, whether you're a person with a disability or a person without a disability who's unemployed or doesn't have access to work. I know that the Common Front has a plan to raise the rates. Can you talk a little bit about that plan?
Yes. So as a background, rates are low in this province because they've been passively cut, we'll say, because they've been kept at a rate that no longer reflects the cost of living. They were maybe closer to that 20, even 30 years ago, but there is a philosophy that says we have to push people off of these things, and if we push them off, they'll find their feet and end up as what we expect to be quote-unquote contributing citizens. But the reality is that when you don't give people adequate supports and you punish them economically, basically, for living in poverty, that this actually perpetuates the cycle, right? And it's wrong on so many levels to not give people adequate supports that they need. So for a long time, the Common Front has pushed for social assistance rates that actually reflect the cost of living, so that people can afford all of the necessities of life and maybe a little bit more, so that they can have a sense of leisure, of dignity, of purpose, of hobbies, those kinds of things that make life more well-rounded and full and purposeful. And on the other side of that, we've recently added another aspect to the campaign, which is looking at the economic unit policy and the what's called the wage clawback. So there are, in addition to the rates being low, there are other policies that are prohibitive and again punishing to people who depend on social assistance. It makes it difficult to live with a common law partner or with a married person who works if you depend on social assistance. The government will cut your social assistance even if you need it to be able to sustain a household. If you have one member of the household who works, then the person who depends on social assistance loses their social assistance. Likewise, if you have the ability to work, not everybody on social assistance does, and not everybody on social assistance has to, but if you have the ability to work and you would like to, you're actually prevented from entering the workforce in many ways because your wages are actually clawed back after $500. So it actually disincentivizes people. There's a hypocrisy there when we talk about wanting to push people out into the market, get them jobs and things like that. But then the people who are actually trying to do that are still disciplined economically because we don't want people to be accumulating too much when they're in poverty, which
God
is
forbid.
a very
And I mean, we're talking here, between $7,000 and $9,000 a year for an individual.
These numbers, when you look at, say, compared to wealthy people in this province, wealthy people in these countries, these are very marginal numbers, but they can be very meaningful when you're trying to carve out a more sustainable, more dignified life, and you're living in poverty.
Yeah.
I was asked a question. I've worked my entire life mostly. There was a 5-year period where I was on assistance, and it was when my partner left. I had an 18-month-old, and I chose to stay home. And the person said, "Tanya, you're really, really bright. Why are you on assistance?" And I said, "Because I can do math."
Right.
I didn't have a parent to give childcare, help me with childcare. I didn't have a vehicle to get to work, and there's no buses, so I was taking taxis. So say if I worked at Tim Hortons, Dollarama, say I got $450 gross, that brings, $387 home a week. $150 for taxis and $150 for daycare.
Yeah, and that's a cheap daycare.
That doesn't leave me enough to feed my child. That's why a lot of women are home. 46% of single mothers in this province live in poverty because they have no choice.
So in addition to raising social assistance rates, from your perspectives in the kinds of work and kinds of jobs that you do, what do you think is one of the most important things that the Higgs government can do to address poverty in New Brunswick? And I guess, Tanya, we'll go to you first.
Well, I'll tell you what's more helpful than a nickel. We need early intervention, and we need family intervention. We have a lot of fear when you mention the word social work in front of, say, the clients that I work with. The fears are natural, and we need to address how we can lower the adverse childhood experiences that people experience when they live in poverty. Because the less adverse childhood experiences, the less impact on the physiology of the brain. You are more capable, more able to use those executive skills, executive function skills that make productive members of society. These people that live in poverty can't get to the potential that they're supposed to be at. Every single one of us could be more than we are with help and support. It starts with policy change, but I think we need feet in the streets. We need skills programs and mentorship programs and help with addiction. We need mental health initiatives and incentive for people to ask for help.
Yeah. And what do you think, Abram? How would you respond?
I think one of the biggest things is to actually commit to an anti-poverty strategy. We have this very linear view of progress on things like poverty, but it's actually gotten by and large worse every decade since the 80s in this province, and yet there is actually less attention paid to poverty as an overarching problem in the way we talk about making policy in this province. And so having an actual anti-poverty strategy that encompasses every aspect of it, and I unfortunately we're a long way off from that. For example, in the last provincial budget, the government solicited consultations. And there were lots of questions about all kinds of challenges and problems for the province, but there was nothing about poverty. No questions about how we can better address poverty, how we can better, deal with poverty, how we can better provide services for people in poverty. And the reality is that in a country as wealthy as ours, nobody should have to live in poverty. And if you want to, and you should really, as any government, if you want to do the right thing, you should be committed to that. And to accomplish that, you need to have a strategy that incorporates housing, incorporates labor policy, incorporates education. It needs to be overarching, holistic, comprehensive, and you need to have the will to enact some of those policies across a variety of sectors. I think the Common Front's recommendations are pretty good, but I think we could even go beyond that when we think about an overarching anti-poverty strategy.
And the willingness to spend some money.
Absolutely.
Right, and this government does not want to spend money on people who are struggling.
Yes, and it is not really about economics. That's the crux that you'll hear a lot. It's really ideological. It's about what kind of economy we want to have. It's not about economics in the abstract, because there are lots of evidence that anti-poverty strategies help, obviously, people in poverty, but actually society and economic life as a whole. We've talked about this recently with the minimum wage. When you increase the buying power of people at the bottom of the wage tier, that actually goes a lot further when you increase the buying power of the wealthiest, because they can never spend that much money. They're always going to be leaving some of it in a bank account, whereas people, at the bottom are more likely to spend it on local businesses, on those basic things that need a little bit of stimulation and activity, especially coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. Everybody's talking about the economic recovery. So there's all of these policies can pay for themselves in economic terms. They can create economic growth. They can create wealth for the province. But it's about what kind of economy we want to have and who gets that wealth, not so much about the economy in the abstract.
Yeah, and I want to end on a high note. So, I really appreciate all of your insights. Tanya, I was going to ask you about the different kinds of myths about people living with poverty, but I think you've covered a lot of them today. So, I read an article that you were interviewed in that talked about the generosity of people who live with poverty. And I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a little bit for us.
People that go without understand and have an authentic compassion. I love my community. I've been looking for grace my whole life. I looked for it in men, and I looked for it in different jobs, and I looked for it in geography, and I looked for it in a different size jeans. And I found it in my struggling community. I know the challenges and how resilient and how kind my community is. I love Milltown. You could break down in Milltown, and it doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter where you're from or what you look like. Somebody's gonna stop and help you. My little boy, I have faith that if he fell down, off his bike, anybody in a house will come out and see if he's okay. We rally when there's death and misfortune, and I think it's because we understand intimately darkness changes people and struggle changes people, and I think we as a community of Maritimers kind of laugh through the struggle, and my community has that in spades. My community is filled with talent and untapped resources, and every single person in my community could succeed, could actualize a better community, a better Canada, a better New Brunswick, if they only had less barriers and obstacles in the way. Because being privileged isn't having perks and affording good things. It's about the obstacles that you didn't have to face that I do.
Right, and I think that's such a great place to end. Thank you both so much for coming and sharing your expertise and knowledge on this issue, and I look forward to having you back.
Thanks so much for having me. It was nice to meet both of you.
It was nice to meet you both as well. Thank you so much for having me.
That is it for the very first season of the NB Debrief. Thank you so much for joining us. The NB Debrief is a partnership between the NB Media Co-op and Charlotte County Television, two independent media outlets. As always, you can email us at nbdebrief@chco.tv. See you soon.
No downtown is from this town, long walk, long and clean now. Yes, it is, yes, it is, yes, it is. Company keeps out the phone to me, they say, it's our city, our town. Sure it is, sure it is, sure it is.